In the world of The Sopranos, everyone is always talking about the rules. The old-timers, the guys who came up in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, are spoken about with a kind of respect that borders on worship. They supposedly lived by a strict code: loyalty, silence, no drugs, no talking to the law, no messing with friends' wives, no killing made men without permission. On paper, it sounds like a tight system that keeps chaos away. But when we actually look at Tony Soprano's New Jersey crew, what we mostly see is a group of men who treat those rules as suggestions. They repeat the words, they quote the stories, but when those rules get in the way of money, ego, or personal feelings, they bend them, ignore them, or break them completely. That tension between the code and the reality is one of the main reasons the show feels so real. The rules are there, but they are not sacred anymore. They are tools, excuses, or weapons used when convenient. The New Jersey crew still pretends that they are part of some noble tradition, yet their day-to-day behavior proves that almost nobody truly believes in those rules as something higher than themselves. They might still fear the consequences of breaking them, but deep down, they do not see them as morally necessary. They see them as obstacles to get around. One of the clearest examples is the rule of Omerta, the law of silence. In the old stories, you never talk to the cops, no matter what. You do your time, you keep your mouth shut, and you protect the family. In Tony's crew, that rule's already breaking from the first season. Pussy bumping zero flips when he gets hit with the drug case, and he wears a wire for the FBI. Jimmy Altieri is suspected of doing the same and gets clipped. Later we find out that Ray Curto has been a rat for years, quietly talking to the FBI the whole time. Eugene Pontecorvo wants to retire to Florida, and his contact with the Bureau shows that he, too, has been feeding them information. Adriana, who is not even a made member, but is very close to Christopher, becomes an informant under pressure. By the end of the series, even Carlo Gervasi is believed to have flipped to save his son. If Omerta were truly sacred, if this rule were actually lived, this number of informants would be almost impossible. Instead, what we see is that most of these people never really believed that taking the oath meant dying rather than talking. The oath was part of the ceremony, part of the show. When the real pressure came, when prison, addiction, or family threatened them, they chose themselves. The old rule says that you are supposed to put the organization above everything. The modern reality in New Jersey is that self-interest comes first, and the rule is something they tell other people to keep them in line. Drugs are another area where the rules look clear on paper and completely fake in practice. There is this old idea that Cosa Nostra does not deal drugs. Even on the show, Junior and others talk about how the old bosses did not want the family mixed up in narcotics. But by Tony's time, heroin and cocaine are everywhere. Christopher's whole arc is tied to drugs. He uses them heavily, he sells them, and many of his criminal moves are connected to dealing or robbing drug dealers. His addiction is not just a personal failing, it is a direct break of the rule that a made man should be sharp, disciplined, and reliable. Getting high on your own supply is one of the clearest violations of old school code. Tony himself plays both sides of this rule. He acts disgusted when he sees the damage drugs cause. He yells at Christopher about his habit and speaks as if he wants to keep drugs at arm's length. But when money's on the table, he has no problem taking a piece of anything that earns. He lets people under him deal, he takes his share, and he hides behind the idea that he is just collecting a taste from guys doing what they want. The crew's attitude shows that the anti-drug rule is not taken seriously as a moral line. It is just something they bring up when they want to judge someone or when they need to blame the younger generation for being out of control. The rule about not messing with friends' wives or girlfriends is another classic that gets broken in quiet ways. On paper, you do not touch another made guy's woman. That rule is supposed to protect the family from deadly jealousy and keep things clean. Yet Tony comes dangerously close to violating it with Adriana. He might never sleep with her, but he opens the door to something that should never have been allowed. He spends time alone with her, plays with the idea in his head, and admits later that there was an attraction. Even the suggestion of that kind of crossing is a betrayal of the rule. It shows how Tony, the supposed defender of tradition, does not actually see the code as untouchable if it clashes with his own ego and needs. This habit of bending that boundary shows up in smaller ways too. The show often hints that affairs and secret relationships are everywhere in their world. The wives cheat emotionally, the men cheat physically, and everyone looks the other way as long as it does not explode into public drama. The rule about not touching another man's woman becomes less a real law and more a guideline: do not get caught, do not embarrass anyone, and do not force the boss to deal with it. Honor, in the old sense, is replaced by appearances. Maybe the most brutal rule in the Mafia Code is the one about killing a made man. Traditionally, you are not allowed to kill someone who has taken the oath without the approval of the higher-ups. It is supposed to create stability. But in Tony's world, that rule gets ignored when emotions get hot. Ralph Cifaretto is a perfect example. Ralph is a made man, a big earner, and connected to New York. Yet after the fight about the racehorse Pio Mai and the anger over Tracy's death, Tony eventually kills him in the basement like a common enemy. There is no formal sit-down, no official blessing. Tony does it because he feels disrespected and disgusted. He cleans it up with a lie about Ralph disappearing, but the fact remains, Eltham, he killed a made guy without proper authorization. By the old code, this should have caused a huge problem. In practice, everyone just adapts to the new story. New York asks a few questions, but they are already used to rules being bent when convenient. The threat of war is handled through lies, not through honest handling of the rule that was broken. Again, we see that the rule is not really sacred. It matters only as long as it does not clash with the boss's pleasure and power. Tony's decision to have Christopher killed is another, more complicated break of old-school values. Christopher's family, both by blood and by the life. In the old stories, you do not kill your own nephew, your protege, the guy you once called your heir, unless it is an absolute last resort and handled with ritual. But Tony suffocates him on the side of the road after the car crash, almost casually, with no one's approval and no real process. It is not a sanctioned execution in the traditional sense. It is a personal choice, a moment where he decides that Christopher is too much trouble, too weak, too dangerous to his own comfort. If we take seriously the idea that family is everything, and that the life is built on loyalty, Tony's act is one of the deepest betrayals in the whole series. Yet inside his head, he justifies it with excuses. He tells himself that Christopher would have eventually brought them all down, that his drug use and recklessness broke the rules first. Instead of seeing his own act as a betrayal of the code, Tony twists the code into something that lets him feel like the responsible one. The rule becomes whatever helps him sleep at night. Respect for the chain of command is another rule that sounds nice, but is rarely honored in practice. In theory, you do not go around your boss, you do not undermine him, and you do not talk to higher-ups behind his back. In Tony's crew, everyone is always maneuvering. Polly runs to Johnny Sack in New York behind Tony's back to complain. Little Carmine and Johnny fight over who is really in charge of the Lupertazzi family, and New Jersey gets pulled into it. Junior is supposed to be the boss in season 1, but Tony has already set up a separate structure where he's really the one in power. Even the way Tony got to the top is based on quietly ignoring the formal rules. He allows Junior to take the title to keep the old men happy, but he takes the power for himself. On one level, that is smart politics. On another, it shows that titles, ranks, and formal codes are more for show than actual guidance. The men in New Jersey talk constantly about hierarchy, yet they violate it whenever it suits them, as long as they can manage the fallout. The rule about not bringing heat on the organization is also supposed to be central. You are not meant to attract attention from law enforcement. You do not talk business on the phone, and you are careful about where you meet. The show is filled with scenes where these men casually ignore that. They talk openly in restaurants they know are bugged. They meet in places they suspect are wired and just shout louder or joke about it. Christopher and others constantly complain about the FBI while at the same time making their jobs easier with careless talk. Tony himself sees a shrink, which is something that would horrify the old generation. Telling your private thoughts to an outsider, especially one who keeps notes, is the exact opposite of the culture of silence. He hides it because he knows it breaks the rules, but he keeps going because he cares more about his own mental survival than about the code. Again, we see that the rule is real enough to make him lie, but not real enough to make him stop. Another core value that is supposed to be central to the mafia identity is the idea that this life is for men only. Women are not to be directly involved in business. Yet in New Jersey, the boundary between the men's world and the family home is constantly broken. Carmela knows far more about Tony's finances and crimes than she should. She takes active roles in hiding money, investing it, and protecting it from the government. She might not sit at the back room table, but she is part of the machine. The children also grow up with full awareness. Meadow and AJ know what their father does. They joke about it, ask questions, and use that knowledge in their own lives. Meadow uses the fear of her father as a kind of shield when she dates Jackie Jr. and later Finn. The old rule that kids should be kept in the dark and protected from the life does not really exist here. Tony wants to think of himself as a father who separates business from home, but in reality his home is soaked in the business. There is also the so-called rule about no homosexuality in the life. Vito Spatafor's story shows how that rule is still powerful in a hateful way, but also not taken seriously as a real principle. The men react with disgust, violence, and humiliation when they find out Vito is gay. They act like the old code has been broken in the worst possible way. Yet these same men ignore all kinds of other rules daily. They break Omerta, they chase drugs, they kill made men without permission, they steal from each other. The one rule they suddenly pretend to care deeply about is the one that allows them to act cruel and superior. If the code was truly about honor, loyalty, and discipline, the rule about sexuality would not be the hill they choose to die on. But for this crew, the rule is mostly an excuse to bully, to control, and to project their own fears. They do not see it as a deep moral truth, just another tool to police who fits into their image of a real man. When Vito tries to come back and promises big earnings, they could, in theory, bend the rule like they bend all the others. Instead, they choose violence because it makes them feel strong and traditional, even while the rest of their lives show they are not living by the old standards at all. Even smaller rules, like no stealing from the boss or from other made guys, are constantly broken. The card game with Davy's Catino is a good example. Tony destroys a lifelong friend's life by pulling him into a bust out. On paper, maybe that is just business, but in the old school way of thinking, there was also supposed to be some line where you do not destroy certain relationships. Tony likes to talk like loyalty and friendship matter, but when he sees an easy score, the rules around protecting your friends vanish. Davy is not a stranger, he is part of Tony's personal life. Breaking him for money is a kind of moral theft, and Tony barely loses sleep over it. Paulie does the same type of thing on a smaller scale. He skims from the Russian in the Pine Barrens episode, he squeezes locals too hard, he takes advantage of anyone who cannot fight back. These moves create problems that Tony then has to manage. By old standards, constantly causing trouble for the family over small personal scores would be seen as childish and dangerous. Yet Paulie keeps doing it, because in this new era, the rule "do not be a greedy, short-sighted idiot" is not really enforced. When we look at all these examples together, a pattern appears. The rules of the mafia still exist in words, in rituals, and in stories about the past. The men repeat them at wakes, at sit-downs, in the back room of the Bing. But inside the New Jersey crew, almost no one truly treats them as something sacred. The rules are flexible, bendable, and often ignored entirely. They are used more as props to justify decisions, to shame others, or to pretend that this life has more honor than it really does. Tony Soprano himself is the best symbol of this. He wants to see himself as part of a tradition, as a provider, as someone who keeps the old ways alive in a changing world. At the same time, he is the one who breaks some of the deepest parts of that tradition whenever they get in the way of his comfort, his anger, or his profit. He kills his nephew, he lies to his mentors, he betrays friends, he bends every rule of silence by pouring his heart out in therapy. He is constantly negotiating between the image of the code and the reality of his own flawed character. In the end, the tragedy of the New Jersey crew is that they live in a time when the old rules no longer really fit, but they do not have anything solid to replace them with. The code has turned into half-remembered slogans. The men know they should respect something bigger than themselves, but they do not truly respect anything except money, pride, and survival. The rules that should have given their world structure are mostly broken, twisted, or ignored. What is left is a fake version of honor, where everybody talks about the past while quietly doing whatever they want in the present. That is why their story feels so unstable. The rules that could have kept them together are gone as a real force, even if the words still hang in the air. The New Jersey crew is not destroyed by the FBI alone or by rival gangs. They are slowly eaten from the inside by the gap between what they say they believe and how they actually live. And in that gap, every rule that once mattered turns into just another lie they tell each other and themselves to avoid facing the truth about who they really are.